Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to be able to speak in this debate on the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. I want also to welcome the Secretary of State's comments and those of the respective front benches, and indeed of many honourable and right honourable members throughout the chamber from both traditions and from none, who have put their points very thoughtfully and very succinctly. I would hope that this House is united in wanting to protect the legacy of the Northern Ireland peace process. A return to sectarian violence is surely unthinkable, although I do heed the Secretary of State's warnings and voiced by other members, honourable members this afternoon, that we ought not to take peace for granted. We should not be complacent. And I do hope we can recommit ourselves to ensuring that the institutions established under the Good Friday Agreement are able to work. However, to protect the legacy of the agreement, we must ensure that not only that the political institutions work, but that they uphold civil rights, justice and essential freedoms. So I'd like to focus my remarks today on the issues faced by journalists and the free press in Northern Ireland, and I would refer the House to my entry in the Register of Members' Interests and point out that I'm honoured to be co-chair of the National Union of Journalists Parliamentary Group. The NUJ represents journalists, photographers and other media professionals in both the UK and the Republic. The democratic process in Northern Ireland, like all democratic nations, depends on the ability of local and national media to report what's going on in our communities. We've seen this recently, for example, with the BBC's threat to undermine Radio 4's much-loved morning breakfast show, an issue that's been that my honourable friend, the member for South Down and the member for Strangford have raised in previous debates. The outcry from listeners led to journalists balloting for strike action. The strength of feeling and the local connection is a particular feature of local radio, which makes it one of our trusted news sources. I was interested in the Minister's comments about a discussion he'd had with John Major in the era of social media, where John Major, I think, had suggested that if social media had existed today, we maybe wouldn't have been able to have a Good Friday Agreement, because certainly they weren't around 25 years ago. So locally sourced, honest, local relevant news matters more than ever. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, whilst journalists everywhere are called upon to report fairly without fear or favour, to be a news journalist in Northern Ireland still requires real courage. And that's an attribute that's been referred to by several members, including my friend, the right honourable member for Leeds Central. Every journalist who does this work deserves the admiration of this House. The Good Friday Agreement hasn't stopped the continued violence or serious threats journalists sadly experience for simply doing their jobs. Often these threats are from paramilitary or associated criminal gangs. One of the most egregious examples of this was the killing of Sunday World journalist Martin O'Hagan, who was shot and murdered in cold blood in 2001 whilst walking back from a night out in Lurgan with his wife, who herself has sadly passed away just last year, some 21 years later, with the killers still not having been brought to justice. This is despite a former soldier.
I have to interrupt the honourable gentleman. I'm advised that this is the subject of an ongoing legal case. Should not be referred to in the chamber. Mr. Morris.
I'm grateful for your advice, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I did seek advice from the Speaker's office in relation to the references that I was going to make, but I'll adhere to your updated advice. I'm not going to comment on the case, but speaking to BBC's Northern Ireland Spotlight programme, that there are clear indications that the police service have more than a good idea of those who are responsible. So despite more than 2 decades having elapsed, the family, friends and colleagues of Martin O'Hagan are still waiting and calling for justice to be served. In my view, and I think in the view of the majority of members and honourable members and right honourable members in this House, we cannot allow journalists in Northern Ireland or anywhere in our country to be intimidated and murdered with impunity. Mr. Deputy Speaker, to date, the British government has sadly resisted calls from the NUJ and others to launch a fresh, independent inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the killing. But I would like respectfully to reiterate this request to the Secretary of State today, because it's the only way that the disturbing questions raised by this case can be answered. A colleague, my honourable friend, the member for Hornsey and Wood Green, referred to another case for Lyra McKee, who was shot dead in 2019 while reporting on the Cregan riots. Our thoughts and prayers remain with her partner, family and colleagues who continue to mourn her loss. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm not going to mention the details of the case because I understand the sub judice rules preclude me from doing that, because as you rightly point out, it's an ongoing case and 2 individuals are currently on trial charged with murder. But I think it is in order, sir, if I join with the General Secretary of the National Union of Journalists, Michelle Stanistreet, if I may quote from her, in tribute to Lyra's life, and she said, and I quote, "While Lyra's life and career were cruelly cut short, her legacy lives on. Lyra's spirit and passion for journalism inspires our collective campaign to thwart those who seek to undermine the vital function that journalism plays in our society, and our commitment to ensure that journalists are able to go about their work safely, free from attack, intimidation and harassment." I would say that the NUJ have welcomed the British government's initiative in setting up the National Committee for the Safety of Journalists, which brings together representatives from the government, journalism, policing, prosecution services and civil society to work in collaboration to make sure journalists in the UK are able to operate free from threats and violence. However, we must also call out the intimidation of journalists by the state and the police. And I'm speaking here about the wrongful arrest of investigative journalists Trevor Burney and Barry McCaffrey. Disappointingly, these arrests were carried out by officers from my own force in Durham. Trevor and Barry produced an award-winning documentary, No Stone Unturned, about the Loughin Island massacre towards the end of the Troubles. The 2 journalists successfully brought a judicial review challenging the legality of search warrants which were issued. This led to the police services of Northern Ireland deleting copies of the records obtained from their mobile phones and laptops, as well as a substantial award in damages. The investigation into Trevor and Barry was flawed, and I recall having met Trevor and Barry here in the Palace of Westminster, I recall a phone call being made to my constituency office after that meeting, where a photograph had been taken of me meeting with these journalists. This led to an unprofessional and abusive call to my constituency office by a senior Durham police officer involved in the investigation, who would go on to further discredit himself with emails attacking the courts and the Lord Chief Justice. Mr. Deputy Speaker, if I may, I would like to highlight a final example. Journalist Patricia Devlin, who was written for the Sunday World and other publications, was subject to a vile campaign of intimidation and abuse, including a message received on social media threatening her baby. Her name was later chillingly spray-painted onto a wall, along with graffiti depicting the crosshairs of a gun target. Following a manifestly inadequate investigation, Patricia made a complaint to the police ombudsman, and the PSNI finally re-investigated the crime and tracked down the identity of the social media user responsible. However, the prosecuting authorities decided not to proceed to trial. Whilst I can't make any inferences about the specific circumstances of this case, I express the concern of journalists and their trade union, particularly those in Northern Ireland, that there are far too many incidents where a perpetrator is known to the authorities, but the victims are being denied justice, being denied protection to protect undercover intelligence assets. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I hope we can protect the legacy of the Good Friday Agreement by recommitting ourselves to both its terms and spirit. I ask the House and the Government to do everything possible to uphold the civil rights, justice and essential freedoms that all our communities deserve to enjoy. Yeah.